We live inside a manufactured stability, a carefully staged reality where everything appears solid, predictable, and safe, not because it truly is, but because we have collectively agreed not to look beneath the floorboards. Under the global economy, the numbers never stop moving. They tick quietly, cold, indifferent, like a bomb with a broken timer. No one knows the exact second it will explode, but anyone who understands mathematics knows it will. Most people believe currency collapse is a distant abstraction, something that happens to failed states, forgotten centuries. People who lived long before us, they believe it cannot happen here. Not now. Not to the money in their pocket. History says otherwise. Currency collapse is not vague. It is not theoretical. It unfolds with terrifying precision. It happens on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when the bank opens, and the doors never unlock. It happens when the price of bread jumps 40% between breakfast and dinner. It happens when a lifetime of savings, calculated down to the final decimal, is suddenly insufficient to survive a single week. And when that moment arrives, there is no time to learn, no time to adapt, no time to look into it later. To understand how people survive these moments, we must abandon the idea that history is a collection of moral stories. History is not a narrative. History is data. Exact dates, exact numbers, exact mechanisms. Every monetary collapse follows the same hidden pattern. Wealth does not disappear. It moves, it transfers, with mathematical certainty, from those who trust the system to those who understand it. If you want to stand on the right side of that transfer, you must study history not for entertainment, but for survival. To understand the anatomy of a currency collapse, we must begin at the source, not with a failed state, not with chaos, but with the first true hyperinflationary superpower in human history, the Roman Empire. Rome did not fall the way we are taught in school. It was not suddenly overrun by barbarians pouring through the gates. By the time the Goths arrived, Rome was already hollowed out from within. The empire was destroyed by its own money. In the 3rd century AD, Rome faced a crisis that feels uncomfortably familiar to the modern world. Endless wars along distant frontiers, a military budget that consumed the state, a growing welfare system meant to pacify the population, and a tax base that could no longer support any of it. The math stopped working. Unable to raise taxes further without risking rebellion, the emperors chose the path that governments always choose when they run out of honest options. They cheated. The silver denarius was the foundation of the Roman economy, the reserve currency of the ancient world. In the time of Augustus, it was nearly pure silver, 95% honest metal, trustworthy money. But soldiers had to be paid, and silver mines do not magically produce more silver on command. So the emperors began to dilute the coin. Under Nero, the silver content dropped. Under Marcus Aurelius, it dropped further. By the reign of Gallienus into 60 AD, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was no longer a coin. It was a copper disc coated in a thin wash of silver, so thin it rubbed off on your fingers. This was not inflation by accident, it was inflation by policy. The result was the crisis of the 3rd century. Prices exploded, trade collapsed, confidence evaporated. But the Roman state refused to accept responsibility, and said, it did what states always do when they destroy money. It blamed the merchants. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a document that should be required reading for every modern citizen. It listed thousands of goods, from wheat to clothing to wild animals for the arena, and imposed strict price caps on all of them. The punishment for violating these caps was death. The punishment for hoarding was death. The full power of the Roman military was unleashed to force people to trade at prices that guaranteed financial loss, and the outcome was immediate. Inflation did not stop. The economy simply vanished. Merchants closed their shops. Farmers abandoned their fields. No one was willing to exchange real goods for worthless coins. not even under threat of execution. The intricate trade networks that had sustained one of the most advanced civilizations in history disintegrated. Rome reverted to barter. A society capable of building aqueducts and colosseums was reduced to people trading chickens for shoes. The lesson from Rome is foundational and unforgiving. Economic laws are stronger than political laws. You can imprison a merchant, you can execute him, but you cannot force him to sell at a loss. When a government destroys its currency, it does not merely destroy money, it destroys specialization, it destroys trust, it destroys civilization itself. 14 centuries after Rome taught the world how to destroy metal money, France would teach it how to destroy paper. By 1720, the French state was bankrupt. Decades of war under Louis XIV had drained the treasury. The crown owed more than it could ever hope to tax, and default was politically unthinkable. Into this crisis stepped a man who promised something revolutionary. John Law, a Scottish gambler, mathematician, and self-styled economic visionary. Law's idea was intoxicating in its simplicity. Gold was scarce, rigid, limiting growth. Paper, on the other hand, was flexible, expandable, liberating. Why anchor money to metal, he asked, when it could be backed instead by future prosperity? Law convinced the French regent to allow the creation of the Banque Royale and the Mississippi Company. Paper notes would replace gold. Those notes would be backed by the vast, untapped wealth of French colonies in Louisiana. On paper, it was genius. In reality, it was fantasy. Shares of the Mississippi Company became the most desirable asset in Europe. Prices doubled, then doubled again. Servants, clerks, and minor nobles became rich overnight. Paris turned into a city of speculators. Cafes became trading floors. Fortunes were made in days. So many people became rich so quickly that a new word had to be invented to describe them. Millionaire, but the wealth was not real. The Louisiana Territory was largely swamp and wilderness, not a river of gold. The paper prosperity was built entirely on confidence, and confidence is a fragile thing. When investors finally attempted to convert their paper notes back into gold, the illusion collapsed. The bank did not have the metal, it never had. Panic spread faster than the bubble ever did. In 1720, the stock price of the Mississippi Company collapsed from 10,000 livres to 1,000, and then to zero. The richest men in France were reduced to beggars almost overnight. John Law fled the country in disgrace, dying years later in obscurity. The psychological damage was profound. For generations afterward, the French word for bank carried a stain of suspicion. The lesson of 1720 is not about greed. It is about confidence. In the early stages of a paper system, money feels like magic. Wealth appears to materialize out of thin air. But, in reality, paper money does not create wealth. It merely borrows consumption from the future. And when the bill comes due, the poverty is as extreme as the illusion of wealth once was. To understand how fast a modern life can be erased, we must examine the most mathematically extreme currency collapse ever recorded. Not Weimar Germany, not Zimbabwe, Hungary, 1946. In 1944, the Hungarian penge was a respectable currency. 2 years later, it was functionally extinct. The statistics of this collapse are so extreme they sound fictional. But they are not. They are precise, documented, lived by millions of ordinary people. By July of 1946, inflation in Hungary reached 41.9 quadrillion % per month. That number is not rhetoric. It is math. Prices were doubling every 15 hours. If you walked into a cafe in Budapest at 9 in the morning and ordered a coffee, the price had effectively increased by the time you finished drinking it. Menus became useless. Waiters stopped printing them. Instead, prices were written on chalkboards and erased and rewritten every hour. Money was no longer a medium of exchange. It was a melting object. On August 1, 1946, the Hungarian government introduced a new currency, the forint. The conversion rate was set at 400 octillion pence to 1 forint. To understand the scale of destruction, consider this. If you gathered every single pence note in existence on the final day of the currency, every bill in the entire nation, their combined value would not have equaled 1/10 of a U.S. cent. The paper wealth of an entire country had been reduced to something smaller than a rounding error. But here is the critical insight. Hungary did not go to zero. The buildings in Budapest did not vanish. Farmland did not evaporate. Gold wedding rings did not turn to dust. The value did not disappear. It escaped the currency. Those who survived a collapse understood something fundamental. Money is not wealth. Money is a measuring tool, and when the ruler itself shrinks, you stop measuring, you start weighing. During the worst phase of the crisis, labor was no longer exchanged for pence, it was exchanged for calories. A day's work was worth a specific amount of lard, flour, or bread, roughly 1,400 calories. Paper assets were annihilated with mathematical perfection. Savings accounts, insurance policies, government bonds, gone, but those who held tangible, caloric, or metallic assets preserved their purchasing power almost perfectly. This is the true lesson of hyperinflation. It is loud, it is visible, and it destroys the unprepared with absolute clarity. Hyperinflation is the loud death of money. It announces itself with chaos, shortages, and panic, but there is a quieter form of destruction, one that erases more wealth precisely because it is slower and harder to recognize. This was the United States in the 1970s. There were no wheelbarrows of cash, no closed banks, no street riots. Over currency, life appeared normal, and yet, one of the largest transfers of wealth in modern history was taking place in plain sight. In August of 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold. At that moment, gold was fixed at $35 per ounce. What followed was not called a collapse, it was called adjustment. By January of 1980, gold reached $850 an ounce. That is a 2,300% increase in the price of real money, or, stated honestly, a 95% collapse in the purchasing power of the dollar against the ultimate store of value. The average American was told not to worry. They were told to save. They were told to invest in blue-chip stocks for the long run. So let's look at the data. In 1966, the Dow Jones Industrial Average reached approximately 1,000 points. 16 years later, in 1982, it was still below that level. In nominal terms, the market went nowhere, but inflation was not standing still. Consumer price inflation peaked at nearly 15% in 1980. Adjusted for inflation, the stock market lost almost 70% of its purchasing power. The disciplined saver was destroyed. The responsible investor was punished. A decade and a half of wealth accumulation vanished without headlines, without panic, and without a single bank closing its doors. Yet not all assets suffered equally. Real estate survived. Hard commodities survived. Assets tied to real, leveraged production survived. The lesson of the 1970s is simple and uncomfortable. You do not need a crisis to lose everything. Sometimes the system takes it slowly and politely while assuring you that everything is fine. If the 1970s showed how wealth can be destroyed slowly, Argentina in 2001 showed how it can be seized instantly without firing a single shot. Throughout the 1990s, Argentina pegged its peso unto one with the U.S. dollar for the middle class. This felt like stability, modernity, safety. People did exactly what they were told to do. They worked, they saved, they deposited their money, often in U.S. dollars, into Argentine banks. They believed the law would protect them. It did not. As government debt became unpayable, rumors spread. By November 2001, depositors began withdrawing cash. Lines formed. ATMs emptied. On November 30th, the bank runs accelerated, and then came the date that mattered. December 1, 2001, the government announced the Curalito. The decree was brutally simple. Withdrawals were limited to 250 pesos per week. Per account, you could see your money on a screen. You could print a balance statement, but you could not touch it. Your wealth had become digital confinement. 1 month later, in January 2002, the final blow landed. All dollar-denominated deposits were forcibly converted into pesos at a rate of 1.4 pesos per dollar, while the true market rate exploded toward 4 pesos per dollar. Nearly 70% of purchasing power was confiscated overnight. This was not a market failure, it was not a crash, it was state-sponsored theft, executed with paperwork and legal language, and yet, not everyone was destroyed. Those who survived were not the sophisticated investors, they were not the diversified portfolio holders, they were the paranoid people who kept physical US dollars, the blue dollar, in safes, deposit boxes, or hidden in their homes, merchants who held inventory instead of cash, grain, leather, wine. In the months that followed, the Argentine real estate market quietly switched to a cash-only US dollar system. If you had physical dollars, you could buy apartments in Buenos Aires for 30 cents on the dollar from sellers who needed liquidity to eat. The wealth transfer was absolute. The system designed to protect savings became the mechanism that confiscated them. The lesson is binary. If your wealth depends on a counterparty, it is not truly yours. In a crisis, the counterparty will always sacrifice you to save itself. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the ruble did not merely inflate. The entire economic operating system disappeared. Factories stopped, supply chains snapped. The official exchange rate became fiction, the black market became reality. But in the chaos of post-Soviet Russia, the most valuable asset was not gold, it was not cash, and it certainly was not rubles, it was access. In the early 1990s, the Russian government undertook the largest privatization of state assets in human history: oil fields, gas pipelines, aluminum smelters, nickel mines, infrastructure built over decades. This wealth was not sold for money in the traditional sense. It was sold through vouchers distributed to the population, on paper. Every citizen received a stake in the future of the nation. In reality, the population was starving. Time preference collapsed to zero. People sold their vouchers for bottles of vodka, cigarettes, or a week's groceries. Not because they were stupid, but because tomorrow meant nothing if today could not be survived. A small group of individuals understood what was happening. They had food, they had security, they had cash liquidity, and while millions sold the future for survival, these few quietly bought it. Assets worth billions of dollars in intrinsic value were acquired for amounts equivalent to thousands of dollars in real poo or casing power. The lesson of the Soviet collapse is not primarily financial, it is psychological. In a collapse, the population's planning horizon shrinks to hours or days. If you are the person who can think in months or years, because you are fed, warm, and safe, you gain an asymmetric advantage. The oligarchs were not magicians. They were simply the only ones who could afford to wait. For decades, there was an unspoken assumption in the Western financial world. Bank deposits were sacred. You could lose money in the stock market. You could lose money in real estate. But money in the bank, especially in Europe, was assumed to be untouchable. Cyprus shattered that illusion. On March 16, 2013, under pressure from the European Union, the Cypriot government announced a bail-in. It was a new term for an old idea. Instead of taxpayers rescuing the banks would rescue themselves by taking money directly from depositors. Accounts under 100,000 euros were temporarily frozen. Accounts above that threshold were not just frozen, they were raided. Nearly 47.5% of uninsured deposits were confiscated and converted into bank equity in a failing bank. Overnight, nearly half of the liquid wealth of Cyprus's most financially responsible citizens vanished, not through inflation, not through collapse, but through legal decree. The importance of the date cannot be overstated. It broke a post-war taboo in Europe. It established a precedent. Your bank account is not a vault. It is part of the bank's capital structure. In a crisis, depositors are no longer protected. They are absorbed. Cyprus was small, but the precedent was enormous. So, where does that leave us now? The United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan are not experiencing hyperinflation. Not yet. What they are experiencing is more subtle and more effective. It is called financial repression. Financial repression is a deliberate policy choice. Governments drown in debt, and instead of defaulting, they quietly liquefied that debt by keeping interest rates below the rate of inflation. The result is a slow-motion confiscation of wealth. If inflation runs at 5% and your savings account pays 0.5%, you are losing 4.5% of your purchasing power every year. There are no headlines for this. No bank runs. No riots. Just a quiet erosion. Over 10 years, 40% of your wealth is gone. People don't panic. They adapt downward. They notice groceries cost twice as much. They notice housing has become unattainable. They notice the middle class shrinking, but they don't rebel because the television tells them the economy is strong. This is the boiling frog. But the math of sovereign debt suggests the water is heating faster. U.S. federal debt has surpassed $34 trillion. Interest payments now exceed the entire defense budget. This is the event horizon, when a nation must borrow money simply to pay the interest on money it already borrowed. The exponential curve goes vertical. There are only two exits: default, telling creditors it will not be paid, or inflation, printing the money to pay them in devalued currency. Default is political suicide. It ends governments and empires. Inflation is the path of least resistance. They will print, not because of conspiracy, not because of ideology, because mathematics leaves no alternative. So, what does survival actually require? Not optimism, not faith in institutions, not another paper promise. Survival requires a structural reorganization of how you live and how you store value. This goes far beyond buy some gold. The first principle is the elimination of counterparty risk. You must examine every asset you own and ask a single brutal question. If the bank closes tomorrow, do I still own this? If the answer is no, then it is not truly yours. Bank deposits are unsecured loans to a failing institution. Stocks held in street name are one layer removed from ownership. Pensions are promises dependent on future solvency. In a crisis, promises fail first. This is why a portion of wealth must be moved into bearer assets. Physical gold and silver are not investments. They are financial lifeboats. They are the only financial assets that are not someone else's liability. They do not depend on trust. They do not require permission. They are the batteries of value. When the grid goes down, the battery still holds charge. But money alone does not keep you alive. Which leads to the second pillar, the caloric fortress. In the early stages of collapse, supply chains fracture. Modern cities operate on just-in-time delivery. Most have 3 days of food. When trucks stop, shelves empty first. This is not about hoarding. It is about insurance. You need 90 days of calories that require no electricity, no refrigeration, and no fragile logistics. Rice, beans, canned meats, salt, honey. Calories buy you the most valuable asset in a crisis: time. While others are standing in lines, you are thinking. The third pillar is skill arbitrage. In every collapse, the economy reverts from financial abstraction to physical necessity. During the Great Depression, stockbrokers jumped from windows. Cobblers stayed busy. In Bosnia, during the 1990s siege, the richest man on the block was not a banker. It was the man who knew how to refill disposable lighters. Skills that cannot be outsourced or imported become currency. Can you fix a small engine? Can you grow food? Can you sew, weld, solder, treat wounds? In collapse, Usefulness replaces credentials. The fourth pillar is community. The lone wolf prepper is a myth. No single family can grow food, fetch water, maintain security, and rest all at once. You need a tribe, 5 to 10 families with complementary skills, a mechanic, a medic, a farmer, someone who understands security. You pool resources, you pool knowledge, you pool defense. Collapse is not survived alone. There is one final barrier that destroys more people than inflation, debt, or bad policy combined. It is psychological. It is called normalcy bias. Normalcy bias is the brain's refusal to accept a disaster that has not yet appeared in one's personal experience. It is the instinct that says, "This can't be happening. Things like this don't happen here. Someone will fix it." When the Titanic struck the iceberg, many passengers refused to board the lifeboats, not because they were stupid, but because the ship felt warm, stable, and familiar. The ocean looked cold, unfamiliar, dangerous, so they stayed. Today, we are on the same ship. The band is playing. The champagne is flowing. The stock market is at all-time highs. But below the waterline, the hull is breached. Debt is compounding. Currencies are being diluted. Trust is eroding. Water is pouring into the lower decks. The transition from a world of paper stability to a world of real scarcity will be the most traumatic event in the lives of the unprepared. But, for the student of history, it is not a surprise. It is a cycle. The pendulum always swings back, from artificial to real, from debtors to savers, from narratives to numbers, from lies to truth. The collapse of a currency is the market's brutal way of telling the truth after years of political denial. It is a cleansing fire. It burns away zombie companies, unpayable debts, false promises. The fire is painful, but it is necessary. Forests must burn for new growth to emerge. The only question that matters is this: will you be the dry wood that burns, or the seed that waits in the soil, ready for the rain? History offers no guarantees, only probabilities, and the probability of a fiat currency surviving forever is exactly zero. Every single one has failed. The Roman denarius, the French assignat, the Weimar mark, the Confederate dollar, the Soviet ruble. They all went to zero. The US dollar, the euro, the yen, they are not immune to mathematics. They are simply next in line. So do not look at your bank account and see wealth. Look at it and see a clock. Use the time you still have. While the stores are full. While the ATM is work. While the internet is still on. Convert paper promises into real things. Build skills. Strengthen relationships. Because when the storm finally arrives, it will be too late to learn how to swim. You are either prepared, or you are a victim. The history books are open, the warning has been given, the window for preparation is closing. End of transmission.